Memorial Day morning, little Emma arrived at school and saw all the other children with their parents, her heart shattered. Her father had fallen in combat in Afghanistan 6 months ago, and her mother was working double shifts just to survive. No one had noticed the pain she carried, until her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, saw her crying alone in the corner. And from that moment, a miracle began to unfold in the little girl's life. Emma Davis was 7 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone much older. She lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Millbrook, Virginia, a military town where every third house displayed a yellow ribbon and every other family had someone serving overseas. The apartment sat above Murphy's hardware store, where the stairs creaked with each step and the smell of sawdust drifted up through the floorboards. Her mother, Sarah Davis, worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Days at the elementary school cafeteria, nights cleaning offices downtown. She'd come home exhausted, her blonde hair pulled back in a tired ponytail, her hands raw from industrial soap and worry. Sarah was only 28, but loss had aged her in ways that showed around her eyes, especially when she thought Emma wasn't looking. The walls of their apartment were thin enough to hear Mr. Peterson's television downstairs and Mrs. Chen's late-night phone calls next door. The furniture was secondhand, donated by the church after Michael's funeral. A couch with faded flowers, a kitchen table with one wobbly leg, and a bed Emma shared with her mother on nights when the nightmares came. But Emma's corner by the window was sacred. It held a folded American flag, presented to them with military precision and words about grateful nations. Her father's dog tags hung from a small hook on the wall, their metal surface worn smooth from Emma's habit of touching them before bed. And in the center, in a frame she decorated with macaroni and glitter for Father's Day 2 years ago, sat the last photo of Sergeant Michael Davis in his Army uniform, dessert camouflage crisp, that crooked smile she missed more than breathing. Michael Davis had been more than a soldier. He was the kind of father who built blanket forts on rainy Sundays, complete with Christmas lights strung between chairs and secret passwords to enter. He taught Emma to ride a bike without training wheels in the parking lot behind their old house, running alongside her with his hand on the seat, promising he'd never let go until she was ready. He read her bedtime stories with different voices for every character, a gruff voice for the bears, a squeaky one for the mice, and a brave, booming voice for the knights who always saved the day. Michael had deployed twice before, both times returning with stories that made Emma giggle and gifts that smelled like faraway places. But this third deployment felt different. Emma had noticed how her parents talked in whispers after they thought she was asleep, how her mother's smiles became forced, how her father held her just a little longer each night before leaving her room. He'd promised he'd come home for her 7th birthday. They'd planned a princess party in the park, complete with a bounce house and a cake shaped like a castle. Instead, on a Tuesday that felt like any other Tuesday, they'd gotten a knock on the door from 2 uniformed officers who spoke in hushed, careful tones about honor, sacrifice, and grateful nations. Emma had hidden behind her mother's legs, watching as Sarah collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking as she held a folded flag. The officers used words like heroic action and ultimate sacrifice, but Emma only understood one thing: Daddy wasn't coming home. Not for her birthday, not for Christmas, not ever. The funeral had been a blur of uniforms, salutes, and tears. Emma had worn her best dress, the blue one with flowers that her father had said made her look like a princess. She'd clutched his dog tags throughout the service, the metal warming in her small fist as strangers approached to tell her how proud she should be. But pride felt like a word for grown-ups. Emma just felt empty. At Lincoln Elementary, Emma had become the quiet girl in the back row. Mrs. Patterson's 3rd-grade classroom had 23 students, each with their own story, but Emma's silence stood out like a missing note in a familiar song. While other children talked excitedly about weekend trips to their grandparents' farms and family dinners at Golden Corral, Emma sat with her hands folded, listening to their joy like it was a language she no longer spoke. During lunch, Emma had taken to sitting alone at the table by the window that looked out onto the playground. She'd unwrap her peanut butter sandwich, the same lunch every day because it was all they could afford, and eat in careful, small bites while watching other children play games she no longer felt like joining. When classmates invited her to jump rope or play tag, she'd smile politely and say she preferred to read, though she rarely turned the pages. Mrs. Patricia Patterson was a 20-year veteran of the classroom. With salt and pepper hair she kept in a neat bun and the kind of patient eyes that missed nothing. At 52, she'd taught hundreds of children through scraped knees, broken hearts, and family crises. She'd seen shy kids bloom into leaders and class clowns grow into scholars. But there was something about Emma that reminded her of her own son, David, who'd served 3 tours in Iraq before coming home different, quieter, carrying invisible wounds that made him startle at fireworks and avoid crowded restaurants. Mrs. Patterson recognized the signs of a child learning to carry grief too heavy for small shoulders. She noticed how Emma's hand would unconsciously move to her throat during the Pledge of Allegiance, touching something hidden beneath her shirt. She saw how Emma's drawings had changed from colorful houses with stick-figure families to gray landscapes with single trees. She watched Emma flinch whenever someone mentioned fathers or family trips, though the little girl always tried to hide it with a forced smile. Other teachers had suggested Emma might benefit from counseling, from grief support groups designed for military families. But Mrs. Patterson knew Emma needed something different first. She needed to feel normal again, to understand that being different didn't mean being broken. The week leading up to Memorial Day had been especially hard for Emma. Lincoln Elementary had been buzzing with preparation for their annual Memorial Day ceremony, and Mrs. Patterson had assigned a special project. Students were to interview a family member about what Memorial Day meant to them. While classmates excitedly talked about interviewing grandparents who'd served in Vietnam or Korea, Emma sat silent, her stomach knotting with anxiety. She couldn't interview her father. She couldn't ask her mother, who still cried when she thought Emma was asleep. And her grandparents lived too far away in Ohio, barely scraping by themselves since Grandpa's stroke last year. Emma had considered making something up, creating a fictional interview that would let her blend in with the rest of the class. But every time she picked up her pencil to write lies, she heard her father's voice in her memory. Heroes tell the truth, even when it's hard. Her classmates shared stories of family barbecues planned for the long weekend, of parades they'd attend, of relatives visiting from out of state. Lucy Morrison talked about her uncle who'd flown helicopters in Iraq. Jake Stevens bragged that his grandfather had medals from World War II. Sarah Kim mentioned that her cousin was currently deployed in Germany and would call them on Memorial Day. Emma listened to each story, feeling herself shrinking smaller and smaller. She had stories too, incredible stories about a father who'd saved lives and died protecting freedom, but she couldn't find the words to share them. Every time she tried, her throat closed up, and all she could think about was how quiet their apartment would be on Monday while other families celebrated together. Friday afternoon, Mrs. Patterson asked students to share their Memorial Day interview projects. One by one, children stood at the front of the room, reading from carefully written note cards about grandfathers and uncles and family friends who'd served. Emma's turn approached like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable. When Mrs. Patterson called her name, Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood slowly, walking to the front of the room on unsteady legs. 22 pairs of eyes watched her, waiting. Mrs. Patterson offered an encouraging nod, but Emma just stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish pulled from water. Emma began, then stopped. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. I can't. She ran from the classroom, past the surprised faces of her classmates, down the hallway lined with construction paper flags, and into the empty bathroom where she locked herself in a stall and sobbed. Not just for her father, but for all the words she couldn't say, all the pride she couldn't express, all the loneliness that felt like it might swallow her whole. Memorial Day morning arrived crisp and clear. Lincoln Elementary had organized a special ceremony to honor local heroes, inviting families to join their children for a flag presentation and moment of silence. Emma had begged her mother not to tell anyone about her father. She didn't want the pitying looks or the awkward questions. She just wanted to be invisible. As families gathered in the school courtyard, Emma stood apart, watching fathers lift children onto their shoulders and mothers straighten tiny bow ties. Her heart ached with a loneliness so deep it felt like drowning. She pressed herself against the brick wall of the school building, hoping no one would notice she was the only child standing alone. Mrs. Patterson was greeting parents when she spotted Emma in the corner, tears streaming down her face. The little girl was trying so hard to be brave, but her small body shook with quiet sobs. Mrs. Patterson excused herself and knelt beside Emma, not saying anything at first, just offering her presence. "I miss my daddy," Emma whispered, so quietly Mrs. Patterson almost missed it. "I know, sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson replied, her own eyes misting. "Tell me about him." And Emma did. Through tears, she told her teacher about blanket forts and bedtime stories, about promises to come home and dog tags that still smelled like his cologne. She told her about the flag they'd given her mother and the medal that sat in a box because it hurt too much to look at. Mrs. Patterson listened to every word, her heart breaking for this brave little girl who'd lost so much. As Emma spoke, an idea began forming in the teacher's mind, not just for Emma, but for her entire class, her entire school. These children needed to understand what Memorial Day really meant, and Emma needed to know she wasn't alone. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson made a series of phone calls. First to the school principal, then to the local VFW chapter, then to parents, community leaders, and local veterans. She told them about Emma, about her father's sacrifice, and about a little girl who felt forgotten on a day meant to remember heroes like her daddy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By evening, Mrs. Patterson had a plan that would change not just Emma's Memorial Day, but her understanding of what it meant to be part of a community that honors its heroes. The next morning, Emma arrived at school expecting another ordinary day. Her mother had left early for work, leaving Emma to walk to school alone, as usual. She carried her backpack and her father's dog tags, which she wore hidden beneath her shirt for comfort. As she approached the school building, she noticed something different. Cars lined the street, more than usual, and there were people in uniforms standing near the entrance. Emma slowed her pace, unsure what was happening. Mrs. Patterson met her at the school door with a gentle smile. "Emma, there are some people who want to meet you." Before Emma could ask what she meant, a man in an army dress uniform approached. He was tall and distinguished, with ribbons across his chest and kind eyes that reminded her of her father. "Are you Emma Davis?" he asked, kneeling to her level. Emma nodded, suddenly shy. "I'm Colonel James Morrison. I served with your father in Afghanistan. He talked about you all the time. He carried your picture with him everywhere." Emma's eyes widened. "You knew my daddy?" "I did. And I want to tell you something important. Your daddy was the bravest soldier I ever served with. He saved 6 men the day he gave his life. 6 fathers got to come home to their families because of your daddy's courage." Tears began flowing down Emma's face, but this time they weren't just tears of sadness. Mixed in was something she hadn't felt in months: pride. Colonel Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a letter, aged and worn. "Your father wrote this for you before his final mission. He asked me to give it to you when you were old enough to understand what he died for." Emma took the letter with trembling hands. Mrs. Patterson helped her open it, and together they read her father's words. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means I won't be coming home to tuck you in tonight. But I want you to know that everything I did for you. I fought so that little girls like you could grow up in a world where they're free to dream, to laugh, to become anything they want to be. You are my greatest victory, sweetheart. And even though I can't be there with you, I will always be proud to be your daddy. Be brave, be kind, and remember that heroes aren't born. They're made by the choices they make. You have hero's blood in your veins, Emma. Never forget that. I love you to the moon and back. Daddy." Emma clutched the letter to her chest, crying openly now. But around her something beautiful was happening. More uniformed service members had gathered: Marines, Navy personnel, Air Force officers. Parents from her school stood in respectful silence. Her classmates watched in awe as they began to understand the significance of this moment. Colonel Morrison stood and addressed the assembled crowd. Today we honor all fallen heroes, but especially Sergeant Michael Davis, who gave his life so that others might live. And we honor his daughter Emma, who carries on his legacy of courage every day simply by getting up, going to school, and choosing to keep going even when her heart is broken. He turned back to Emma. Your father asked me to tell you something else. He said that every Memorial Day, you should remember that you're not alone. Every soldier, every veteran, every family that has served, they're all your family too. We will never let you walk alone. As if on cue, something extraordinary began to happen. One by one, the veterans in attendance stepped forward and formed two lines, creating a pathway of honor. They stood at attention, hands over hearts, as Mrs. Patterson gently guided Emma between them. As she walked through the honor guard, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. She felt held by something bigger than herself. These weren't strangers. They were her father's brothers and sisters in arms, and they were claiming her as one of their own. At the end of the pathway stood Emma's classmates and their families. But now, instead of pity in their eyes, Emma saw respect. They understood now that she wasn't the girl without a father. She was the daughter of a hero. Mrs. Patterson had prepared one more surprise. She handed Emma a small American flag and guided her to the front of the assembly. Emma Davis, Mrs. Patterson announced, on behalf of your father and all fallen heroes, we name you our honorary Memorial Day ambassador. Will you help us lead the Pledge of Allegiance? Emma looked out at the faces surrounding her, veterans, families, classmates, teachers, all looking at her with respect and love. She thought of her father's letter, of his words about being brave, about having hero's blood in her veins. She stood tall, raised the flag high, and in a voice that carried her father's strength, began, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And every person in that courtyard pledged with her, their voices joining together in a promise that Emma Davis would never walk alone again. After the ceremony, Emma found herself surrounded by new friends. Children who had never spoken to her before wanted to hear about her father. Parents offered their phone numbers to her mother, promising help whenever it was needed. The local VFW chapter presented Emma with a scholarship fund they'd established in her father's name. But the most precious gift came from Colonel Morrison, who pulled Emma aside as the crowd began to disperse. Emma, I want you to have this. He placed a folded flag in her hands, not just any flag, but the one that had flown over the base in Afghanistan the day her father died. This flag flew in honor of your daddy and all the heroes who served with him. It belongs with you. Emma hugged the flag close, feeling for the first time since her father's death that she was exactly where she belonged. As she walked home that day, Emma wasn't walking alone. Mrs. Patterson walked beside her, along with 3 classmates and their parents who had insisted on making sure she got home safely. It was a small gesture, but to Emma, it felt like everything. That evening, Emma sat by her window with her father's letter, the flag from Afghanistan, and his dog tags. For the first time in months, she smiled, really smiled. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Dear Daddy, today I learned what it means to have hero's blood. It's not about being the strongest or the bravest. It's about getting back up when you fall down, about taking care of people who need help, and about never giving up on love even when it hurts. I promise I'll make you proud. I promise I'll be brave. And I promise I'll never forget that I'm not alone. I love you to the moon and back. Your hero daughter, Emma. The next morning at school, Emma walked through the doors with her head held high. Mrs. Patterson was there to greet her, as she would be every morning from that day forward. And on Emma's desk was a small card that read, Reserved for our hero. Because sometimes the greatest honor we can give a fallen hero isn't just remembering their sacrifice. It's making sure their children know they carry that hero's courage in their hearts, and that an entire community stands ready to help them discover just how strong they really are. In a world that often forgets the cost of freedom, Emma Davis became a living reminder that heroes never truly die. They live on in the hearts of those they loved and in the communities that refuse to let their sacrifices be forgotten. The Memorial Day that began with a little girl walking alone ended with her surrounded by a family she never knew she had. A family bound not by blood, but by honor, sacrifice, and the unbreakable promise that no hero's child will ever have to carry their grief alone. And in Mrs. Patterson's classroom, a new tradition began. Every Memorial Day, Emma would lead the ceremony, sharing her father's story and reminding everyone that freedom isn't free. It's paid for by heroes like Sergeant Michael Davis and carried forward by daughters like Emma, who choose courage over fear, hope over despair, and love over loneliness. Because that's what heroes do. They turn pain into purpose, loss into legacy, and tears into triumph. And Emma Davis, all 7 years old, had just shown an entire community what it looks like when hero's blood runs through the veins of someone brave enough to keep her father's memory alive.